Okay. All right, y'all. So welcome to another amazing episode. I have been told by my team that this is episode number 66 of the full set. I am your hostess with the mostest. My name is Didi Delgado, and I am here with my esteemed colleague, none other than the amazing Adrienne Maree Brown. Adrienne, welcome to the full set. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me as your guest.
Thank you. All right. So I'm going to read the bio because people need to know what I have information about, and then we're going to figure out the rest. So Adrienne Maree Brown is the author of Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and also the co-editor of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements. She is the co-host of How to Survive the End of the World and Octavia Parables podcast. Adrienne is rooted in Detroit. Adrienne, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I have to tell you something. I wanted you to come here because I've wanted you to be in community with me for quite some time because I'm selfish, right? I'm a Pisces. I've got Mercury and Gatorade. I've got Capricorn and Jupiter. I don't know what the fuck is going on, right? But I'm like, there's something about your spirit. Like I read spirits, right? I don't read text. So let's just clear that up right now. I have not read any of your books. Your book, Octavia's Brood, was a gift to me last year, and it has been gifted still to myself. I'm like, the gift that keeps giving.
That I just hold.
This is such a solid book, you know.
It feels good, right? I think it feels good, the texture of the book.
And it's a beautiful cover. If y'all are into books, if y'all are into audiobooks, I would definitely say I have some questions for you about science fiction and all the things. We're gonna get into it, but I wanted to put you to work first because I don't know your work ethic. I don't know if that brings you pleasure. I really don't know what you do right now. So we're gonna go through it. Can you do me a favor? It's been such a weird day. Like it's just been a day full of jam-packedness. My cleaning lady left. My makeup artist is still here. Everything is going wrong today. Can we find some centering energy, and can you show us how you center yourself?
Yes, I can. So I do a lot of different things to center myself, but one of the first is just to connect back to breath, right? That usually when everything is going wrong, I'm sort of out of body, out of breath. So the first thing is really get your butt solidly connected to your chair, like rock back and forth, make sure you're actually like, okay, I'm balanced here. If your feet touch the ground, let them really connect with the ground and just feel like gravity is still holding you. Even if you're not paying attention to it, gravity's got you. You're not floating off into space. Just noticing that. And then take a deep breath in, let it out. And then I say some things to myself that help. So one that I've been saying a lot lately is no is a complete sentence. Say it. No is a complete sentence. Mm-hmm.
Do I have to mean it if I'm centering myself?
I mean, just what I like to do is say it and feel how it's resonating inside of me, right? That I'm like, do I know that yet? Do I believe it yet?
Okay.
I operate that way.
Okay. No is a complete sentence.
No is a complete sentence. And then something I've been saying today is, I want this life. I want
this life. No is a complete sentence, and I want this life. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. And then shake
my butt feels good in this chair now. It didn't before. Before I felt off balance, and I don't know how you did that.
Little most of the body is like, oh right. We think we need to tense up and hold ourselves so forward, and just relax and let the earth hold you, let gravity hold you. That takes off some of the labor right there.
Thank you. I hope that people who are watching or who will watch and listen later, since this is a visual podcast, I have no idea still what I'm doing. And you have a podcast. I don't know if you figured out what you're doing, but I hope that people will center themselves today.
Yes. Thanks for the invitation to do that.
So how are you holding up during COVID-19? Like, when I
Mhm.
ask the question, I just mean like, how has it affected the ways you live and you work? Are you still able to find pleasure and joy in your day to day when everyone is literally pushing so much information at you? Pandemic, global uprising.
Yeah, great. I noticed this past week I got sick, and I noticed like the new experience of getting sick is like, is this COVID? Is this a cold? Is this something
You
else?
got the Rona? Okay.
And like really the fear level where I'm like, I don't like to be sick ever. I always think it's the worst case scenario. My doctor, I love my doctor to pieces because I'll just text her like, here's my symptoms. What am I dying of? Like, just tell me,
Right.
just
Right.
and so I was sick. I went and got the COVID test. It came back negative.
Good.
But what I noticed inside that was that I'm like, oh, I've been trying to keep up my normal pace, even though nothing in the world is actually normal right now.
Right.
And I need to slow down so that I have enough room to grieve and to feel panic and to turn and face what's actually unfolding right now, and to recognize we're not going back to anything normal. Like this is a river that keeps flowing towards more
Can you
change, more
repeat that again? Because I've heard people on numerous occasions say, I can't wait till things get back to normal. And you
yeah,
feel,
not going back to normal. We're not going back to normal. I mean, we can go back to pretense, right? Because for a lot of people, pretense is like what we call normal. And so you can pretend like it's
right,
all good. But what I am noticing is that every single day, another level of the abnormality of the transition kicks off. So it's like, okay, if you were in the West Coast trying to act like things were normal, then it was like, well, now it's a complete fire. And so just so you're clear, it's not normal. Or if you're on the Delta region, here's some more hurricanes and some floods. There's no normal. Um, if you are doing immigrant organizing, it's like, oh, actually, they're doing mass hysterectomies. It's even more like, it's like each thing,
right,
more things are getting layered in where it's like, and I've said it, it's like things are not getting worse, they're getting uncovered. And we're
mm,
actually pulling back the veil of all the inequalities and injustices and all the systems that are always at play. But now this president doesn't have the capacity to cover the behavior. It's just bad behavior. It's just corruption. So there's no going back to normal. And how do we seize this as an opportunity? So in my personal life, that's what I mean by I want this life, and really filling in for myself. What does this mean? Like I want to
mm,
be alive. Because I'm not the kind, I always say this when I watch like the zombie sci-fi shows and stuff. I'm like,
I
just
don't want
eat
that.
me first. I'm
Right,
not doing that. I'm not running around for years being like, like no. Um, I want to be an early pat. I want to be an ancestor on the early side and just help y'all out because that's just not who I am. I don't run. I have arthritis. We just got to figure it out. But right now, today, I want this life. I want to be writing and creating. I want to be shaping the future, visioning. I want to be supporting those who need it. I want to help people grieve. I want to help people feel. And yes, I'm finding time for pleasure, although it's different. It's not like I have gone sometimes to exorbitant levels of centering my pleasure. And
right,
now I do feel more like in the small pleasure zone. Like, what are the small pleasures I need to survive? I need to have my orgasms here and there. It may
right,
be a day full of orgasmic release, but I need to make sure I'm attending to that daily need. I need
right.
baths, you know, I
You
need to
need
do,
them.
I need baths. Like, I need
Mm,
to be in hot water, and the water helps me release a lot. I cry in the bath. I just like let stuff go. Um, I need my ratchet TV. I just need it. Like I need things that I'm like, see, that doesn't matter at all. I'm clear. Like
right,
zero
right.
age and stuff where I'm like, okay, the stakes are zero. Um, and I need my tarot decks. I need to hug my lover. I
Which
need to
tarot
hug my
tarot deck
parents.
are you working with right now, or which is your favorite? I would ask.
Right now, my favorite deck I don't have with me, which is the Dust to Onyx Tarot deck, which I adore.
Ooh.
But I ordered the travel one, but it
Hmm.
arrived after I left on this, what has now been a 9-month trip.
Oh
So
wow.
yeah, because I was on sabbatical for 6 months. So I left my
I know.
home in December of last year, and I have not been
Wow.
back
Okay.
because COVID and everything changed. So I love that deck. Here, I just got a new deck called the Ghetto Tarot deck that is really
I want
beautiful.
to know all about it.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's a curious project because it's like a dope artist collective in Haiti
Okay.
recreated the Rider-Waite tarot, like each
Okay.
image perfectly. But then the thing I'm still trying to figure out is like if the money is actually going back to that artist collective or if
Right.
it's
Okay.
the photographer who took the pictures or if they
Right.
decided
Okay.
to vote. But the deck itself is gorgeous. And I just got a new one called the Somatic tarot deck that I think just came out like this year, like a couple
Look at
months ago.
you dropping all the knowledge. Okay.
Yeah, so tarot is my favorite place to
And I
just
wouldn't have
sit.
known that that was one of your interests. Hmm.
Oh yeah, I love it. And I actually just started back on Instagram now. I've started posting a daily movement tarot card. So for people who
Okay.
are trying to bring justice into the world, offering like here's what the tarot has to say for today about that.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that because I've been wondering which are some of the ways that you can still retain pleasure, right? And so
Yeah.
what the story I tell myself about what I just heard you say, right? I'm trying to match your energy right now. Is I hear you saying orgasms really are just centering you, baths are centering you. So for me, that's important to hear because I hope that it resets my association with some of the things that I haven't participated in a while. Like, you know what I'm saying? Because, a person was associated with my last bath. So I'm just like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
love that. Oh yeah.
that.
I mean, so much of anything too with stuff like where other people's energy gets tied into it is like,
Mhm.
oh, how do I clear and reclaim? Because that
Right,
magic actually meant for me. But in the pandemic, I mean, I think like many people, I'm living with more people than I usually live with. I'm like around people much more often. So even for me, just a moment of quiet, I go in the bathroom and I'm just like, I am alone in the bathroom again. Like it's just like this solitude is so great. And I'm with my parents and I'm really finding pleasure in like how can I bring myself present with them with less judgment, with more curiosity. That's hard, like I'm like you can get a very set idea about who your parents are and I'm like
right.
how do I let them be changing and growing too,
Mm.
Mhm.
So some of my next questions, I reached out to a very dear colleague of mine. I don't know if you know them or their work, but it probably doesn't matter because they're just amazing in general. Fire Angel
Ooh.
had asked, how does the energy in Detroit feel to you right now? What seems to be taking shape? And, I think about a while back you had said you moved to Detroit in part because of its post-apocalyptic feel and the resilience of its residents. What about the city do you feel parallels some of the themes of sci-fi? And what the fuck is so important about sci-fi, Adrienne?
Okay, Didi, I like how you ask 5 questions at once. So I'm like, okay, let me see. So the energy right now in Detroit, I'm homesick for it. I haven't been home yet. I get to go soon. So I'm like counting down the days till I get to be home again. What I've been seeing from afar has been some beautiful resistance. I've been watching the 313 Liberation Zone and just like watching all the videos of how they have participated in the uprising. So I'm excited and curious to get home and actually feel what's happening on the ground and how the pandemic is impacting things as we head into a cold winter. Detroit every year, it's just sort of like, how are we going to make sure everyone's taken care of before we head into the winter, And um, Detroit feels like a post-apocalyptic city in a lot of ways. It already went through a crash of capitalism and then the sort of recovery. And I think science fiction, I love this question. Why is science fiction so important? For me, science fiction is a way for us to practice thinking about the future together, planning the future together, dreaming the future together. And a lot of my work references Octavia Butler. And I feel like one of the things that she taught me, as she was a Black science fiction writer who won the MacArthur Genius Award. And just now, her book, Parable of the Sower, actually landed on the New York Times bestseller list, which is huge. It was a thing that she dreamed of. But she wrote in a way, I was like, she's writing critique. She's writing about the world as it is right now. She's writing prophecy based on what she sees happening and how it can unfold into the future. And Octavia's Brood, the book that you were holding, that was our attempt to practice what does this look like as a practice, visionary fiction, to actually say, if we want a future that is different from the one we currently live in, we have to imagine it. And one of the things I'll often offer here is we are living inside of other people's imagination right now today. So we live inside the imagination of people who thought that white men were supreme. We live inside the imagination of people who think that only able bodies matter. We live inside the imagination of people who think skinny is more sexy than fat. That's all imagination. That's
Right.
someone's concept. And then we find ourselves trying to survive inside someone else's imagination. Science fiction, that imagined world is how we end up with the crimes against our people that we end up in. So I always tell this story of how in the Mike Brown scenario, he was killed because someone imagined that he was dangerous,
Right. Okay.
right? So if you think about the power of white imagination, of privileged imagination, they just construct whatever. They say whatever they imagine and they assert it as real. And then we try to respond reality to reality without first saying, wait, what is it we're imagining? What do we long for? We imagine things from our memories. A
Right.
lot of us, like, I remember I have an idea that my ancestors were different than we are now. I have
Right.
an imagination. We hear people say this all, we were kings and queens. I'm like, really? We don't know. I did not
I
receive that memo from any of
I
my
think my aunt
ancestors.
Dolores was in jail a lot. I look at her
No,
picture, I'm like, you
like,
had a hard life, Aunt
might be
Dolores.
the king of the cell.
Right.
But I also think it's like one of my teachers, Jimmy Boggs, was like, a king is still a motherfucker. Like, it's actually not
Mm,
necessarily the goal to be royalty, to have power over, to be so lifted apart from our people. So
right.
how do we imagine something where we all have the conditions of royalty, that we all have enough, that we're all satisfied, that we're all connected, that we all
Ooh.
have love? How do we love our bodies? How do we imagine bodies that are desirable to everyone? Like, so that's to me why science fiction is important, because someone's got to be articulating a future that we then start to shape with our actions.
And so, thank you for that explanation because my experience with science fiction was one time this person wanted to take me out on a date and they were like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I don't know. It's a date. You plan it. You pick something that you think I would like to do. And this motherfucker thought I would like to go see Lord of the Rings and sit in a movie theater for 10 hours. And that was my experience. And I've since seen all the
You got
movies.
the date of someone I should have gone on a date with.
Oh, really? Can we
Yeah.
switch, please? I
I'm
hate
like,
it
that's a
here.
favorite first date to me. I'm like, I don't have to talk to you. I can just sit in the dark and see how you feel. Cool.
I wanted to ask questions about past lives, and I'm like, why the fuck am I learning about Bilbo Baggins? What would you say is the difference? What? I get to know you this way? What would you say is the difference between um I don't want to talk about Tolkien. What would you say is the difference between a white science fiction writer like um J.K. Rowling, aside from
Yeah.
transphobia, right? What
Yeah.
would you say is the difference between someone who imagines white futures and someone like Octavia Butler who designs
Yeah.
Afro-futuristic futures, right? What and why is that important, especially during a time where we're trying to dismantle systems of oppression? What is the best way for us to imagine the world in which we want to live in?
I think what's at the heart of the question that you're asking is there are folks who are doing great inside of society as it currently exists. And so what they're going to imagine is not necessarily going to upend any of the norms that we currently take for granted. And when you look at someone like an Octavia Butler, who was challenged in many, many ways, right? She had disabilities. She was not considered traditionally aesthetically attractive. She was a Black woman. She was a tall woman. She had an underbite. She was an introvert. There were all these ways in which the norms did not suit her. So her imagination is going to be one in which someone like her could be included, centered, a
Right.
protagonist, right? Seen
Mm,
as a leader. And so when you look at her fiction, so much of it features Black women with short hair who are quiet or shy or really nerdy or really obsessive about something or brilliant. And when I read it, I was like, it's me. Like,
right.
I was not considered beautiful or attractive or anything. Thick just became cool. Like, where when I was growing up, I was just like, oh no, bumps, things are sticking out of me. I
Right.
had to struggle for my confidence, my sense of self, my sense of, oh, I'm a miraculous being who absolutely deserves love, desire, care, and to be listened to as a leader. I had to fight for all of that. And her books were one of the ways I was able to wage that battle. And I feel like when I talk to other people who have moved towards an Octavia Butler or moved towards a Samuel Delaney or a Tananarive or Nnedi Okorafor or Tomi Adeyemi, there's all these writers who are saying, we are imagining futures in which Blackness can be centered. We're imagining futures in which women can be centered, in which trans people and gender nonconforming people and people who want to have sex with every kind of person, creature, magical alien, whatever.
It's me.
Exactly. All of us alien sex dreamers are like centered, right? And this whole idea of fundamentally, if we want to not live in a white supremacist world, we have to all learn how to decenter whiteness from the ways we view ourselves, each other, and everything else. And
Ooh.
same thing with capitalism. If we want to live in a world where we are not obsessed with putting a value on each other as if we were still slaves, if we want to put a different scenario in which abundance is available to us and we value each other based on relationship, we have to imagine that, you know, and someone like an Octavia is going to, because her survival depends on it, just like ours does.
Thank you so much for that. I've been thinking about a lot of the conversation around gatekeeping in the Black community, and I'm all for it. If I need to be pushed out of the Black community in order for dark-skinned, fat, Black, disabled, cash poor, femmes, and non-men to be centered, I mean, whatever, like, go ahead. Like,
Mhm.
how do we not stay in the place where Octavia Butler's work is published on the New York Times bestsellers list posthumously, and how someone who looks like Octavia Butler can be centered in our conversations today? Who are the Octavia Butlers of today? Who is standing out to you as someone, not just in science fiction, but someone who is a leader and just isn't getting the shine that they deserve because of aesthetic, because of societal I don't want to say brainwashing, it's societal brainwashing, right? Like about
You know, it's setting up these norms. I mean, I get really excited. I feel like there's a whole crew of us who are fat women who are taking the stage and taking leadership right now, and talking about the body. So someone who stands out to me a lot on that is Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote The Body Is Not an Apology. And
and a former guest.
you have everybody. So I'm like, I was looking at your guesses. I'm like, okay, so you've been talking to everyone.
I
A
just
lot of
like
the people that
talking,
I
that's
just
all.
named as as authors in that of science fiction writers. So Tomi Adeyemi, Tananarive Due, Nnedi Okorafor, Nalo Hawkinson. There's a ton of writers who deserve the shine and are telling stories about how do we imagine different futures. Octavia's Brood is full of voices like that, who are
Okay.
people that we were like, these are not people who necessarily get put on Front Street or listened to in that way. And we think they have some of the most important stories. So there's mothers, there's people with disabilities, there's people with different ways of understanding economy, justice. How do we do future differently than it's done now? But I also, you know, on the question of gatekeeping, I think one of the places I've been landing is I think that I believe in a Blackness that is expansive enough to center itself and have room for everybody who lives that experience. And
Oh no, I agree with you.
to me, it feels like white supremacy comes in the door that's like, oh, we're going to create a small category box and put people in or outside of that box in a certain way. And I recently heard Alicia Garza on her podcast, just like, if you Black, you Black, you know that you have lived that experience, you're having that experience, you're living with that. I'm like, yeah, we need enough room to talk about all of our Black experiences and all the ways we're surviving white supremacy and all the ways we're surviving homophobia within our ranks, transphobia within our ranks, all of it. And I keep thinking about that. How do we create more room to be lifting each other up rather than thinking like, oh, there's only room for one, or there's
Right.
only room
I
for
don't
people.
see it as necessarily exclusionary. I just see it as a lot of times when we have those conversations about, but why not all Black people? We often like don't like that narrative definitely excludes darker skin, fat Black femmes. Like, like I loved Raven Wing's conversation about how radical Black trans women and Black women in general have just been. And it's like that conversation gets absorbed by white trans women, right? and
Mhm.
it's like, yes, it's all of us. You're being divisive if you talk about Black trans women because we're all being. And I'm like, there's
Right.
a way to be queer, there's a way to be trans, there is that conversation that Alicia is having.
Yeah.
And then there is also the way that the conversation of people who are marginalized the most are like, yes, and we are also having this conversation. I'd like to see us all like kind of float in the middle and be like, and here you go. And I take
Yes.
space back and I move.
Yes.
And then I also need to also stand on my Blackness, right? And I'm
Right.
very interested in those
I get
conversations.
interested in those conversations too. And I also get really interested in tangible moves that people make. So
Okay.
I really look at like who's sitting in a position of leadership where they're actually receiving resources and how are they either sharing that space or making a sunsetting plan so that they can actually be moving out of that space. You know, for me, I've never come into a leadership position without a thought of how quickly will I be able to move out of this and who is the rich skin person who's going to come into this role.
Right.
And I actually make sure the conditions are set for that person to succeed
Right.
because I have these artifacts of whiteness. I have this kind of education. I have this kind of travel experience, whatever it is that makes it a palatable thing for people. Cause it's like there's light skinnedness, which creates a certain palatability with philanthropy, for instance,
Right.
which is we're really getting down to it. I'm like, we're talking about creating
Y'all
scenarios
need to
in which
let me know what that philanthropy
here's what
relatableness
this
is.
is, right? That's a lot of what it is. It's like, oh, if you walk into a space where people who have resources are like, oh, you understand me and I understand you,
Right.
then suddenly you can move these ideas. But you're still moving the ideas up against their limitations of, well, here's what we're willing to fund. I'm
Right.
like, how do we break all of that open? One of the ways we break it open is by having the conversations amongst ourselves. What is it we truly want? How do we use all these different mechanisms of privilege to advance what we really want? How do we
Right.
be in relationship with each other? So I never enter a room where Miriam Kaba's name doesn't come out of my mouth. She's a rich skinned person who is organizing around transformative justice. That's my teacher. You could go
Right.
directly to her. If you're talking to me, you're going to hear from her, right? You're going to
Right.
hear her wisdom. And I always think that's important is to identify, okay, who am I responsible for uplifting? And that we're all responsible for uplifting someone else, for other
I think
people,
that that's so
both
appropriate.
in like
Thank you.
intention, but also in very tangible, like resource ways. I get a ton of requests now for my time. And part of my practice is how can I be redistributing these requests, you know? So I'm like, I can take some of them, but there's so many more than I can take. And I'm like,
Right.
how do I have my eyes on the people I want to see getting lifted up into those opportunities? So it's not just a no from me, but it's a no, here's the person, right?
Right.
Things like that to me are like, how do we strengthen a muscle of expanding our abundance, right? It's just like there's enough. But right now we have to make it enough with our actions.
I really appreciate that. I think about starting this podcast and I think about how many people I reached out to, and it's always the folks that have the most load on them that come on the show. I just want to get my shit off, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and those people often are Black folks. I think I've only had one, technically it was two, but it was the same episode. I think I've only had one white person on the show, and it's only because I have that narrative. I code switch in and out of that narrative all day at work. I work
Oh,
for a
do
small nonprofit, and
you're like, I do that.
I do that for, I was talking to Faya yesterday. It's for protection. It's to keep it secluded. And for myself, how I shape shift after 6 is a different Dee Dee than the one that appears in 9 to 5, you know?
I
And
think also like right now, I keep saying this, like when I first came into movement work, caucuses were all the rage. And then we went through a period where it was like, oh, we don't need that really. Folks are just having all these inner dynamic, diversity and inclusion and blah, 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 started to be like the way that everything was approached. And right now, I actually feel like there is so much need to have space that is caucus space, that feels like sacred space. And I think it's important to get to articulate like right now, I just need to be talking to Black folks. And
right,
right now, you need white folks to take the responsibility of talking to each other and seeking resources that are designed specifically for them. Because right now, I'm like, this unlearning, this is not my work. This is for y'all to do. There's
right, right,
for you. You can join Surge, join Catalyst, and there's teachers who are specifically oriented towards helping y'all get free because it is your freedom, right? And then
right,
there also need to be space for Black folks to talk about the 3 billion pressures that are on us. And And sometimes just to relax, it's just like, I just, like you said, for especially for folks, I'm like, I honor the complexity of that, of still being in a situation where code switching is like a part of your survival technology. That's hard.
It's
You need space
difficult.
to take your shoes off, take the bra off, and just be like, okay, you know?
Because I be thinking like, I think that people think that I'm big time, and I'm like, no, I'm still required to work a 9 to 5 in order to survive this
Yeah.
very capitalist world. So,
True of almost everyone I know too. Writers, people are always like, oh, you're a writer now, you published a book. I'm like, every writer is a professor or teaching something or
right.
hustling something, or writing is not where you go. Like,
It's
I
not.
wish it was, but writing is not an NFL type job. So
Do you like poetry?
yes, sometimes,
Okay,
like
I
I like
just
the
needed you to
poetry
tell
I
the
like.
truth on the show. That's all.
I like the poetry I like. I for years I
Mm,
have been like, I'm not really into spoken word. But now it's been funny because what's been coming to me is words that want to be
poems.
spoken.
Yes. I
So
saw I saw
I've
your last
been,
blog post. Listen.
yes, like this, listen, it's just like that came through and it was like, this needs to be heard. You can write it and you can post it, but it needs to be spoken. So I'm humbling myself to that directive because it feels like it comes from beyond me. But there's also a lot of poetry that I don't love. But I will say what I do love about poetry is when people are in the act of writing poetry, creating poetry, there's a way that they're getting into the essence of what's really felt.
Mm,
And I always love that act, whether it's in poems, songs, raps, whatever art form it is that makes you get to the essence of what you truly feel. That I love.
thank you. I want to ask you a question. I've been developing this sort of, I don't know, very baseline. Don't look at me like that. This very baseline.
Okay.
Like,
What are you developing, Didi?
I want to talk about relationship justice, right? Because I think that that's something we glaze over when we talk about accountability and transformative and restorative and
Yeah.
community accountability and all that shit. I don't care about it,
Yeah.
right? It's important, but it's not my work because I feel like a lot of times people are doing the work, and I've had a lot of amazing guest. Ejaris Dixon is someone I've followed for years, and I'm like, I model my shit after you, Ejaris.
Yes.
And
Yes.
also, like, you have to, as you know, like, you've been doing organizing work for a very long time, and you've been doing social constructs for a very long time, and picking them apart and being like, what makes more sense now, right?
Mm.
Relationship justice is our relationship to the actual
No, it's like,
justice,
teach me, what is this?
right? And so I wanted to hear from you. The four components are: the individual is responsible to itself, the
Mm,
individual is responsible to the collective is responsible for itself, and the collective is also responsible for the individual. As you know, when there is an imbalance in even one of those things, there is no accountability. No matter how well someone has written a
mm,
definition for it, all things have to be present. And when
yeah.
I say that to you, is to preface, is like, what is the biggest lie about
Mm.
collective and our individual and collective freedom that capitalism, patriarchy, whatever has told you and that you believed in, even while you do this work? And how are you working to dismantle it?
I think the biggest lie is that we can succeed alone, that we have to do it alone, that we can make it alone, or that alone exists. Like that there's actually some scenario in which we're not interdependent and connected to other people who are impacted by our choices and who are either inspired by our visions or getting inspired by something else. So I think about this all the time because I'm a solo artist in a lot of ways. Like my default position is like, I just want to go in the woods by myself and write, and just
Right.
write and then write some more. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
always thinking. And of course, when I first think something, I'm like, no one's ever thought this. This is a new thing. Like, that's how it feels. And then luckily Google came along in my life and I was able
Right.
to be like, has anyone thought this? And then I find, oh, like, I'm super into mushrooms and mycelium. So I'm like, oh, there's mycelial lines that just go back so far.
This is my
Someone
life.
thought this right before I lived. Someone thought this 30 years before I lived. Someone has thought this forever. The Buddha thought this shit. So
Right.
it helps me to release myself from the idea that me alone as ever being a genius but I can tap into that collective genius energy. And I
Right.
think when we start to let go of the lie of having to do it alone, it changes how we lead, it changes how we partner with others. And I think it changes then what we can do as a collective, because that idea of like, oh, I'm basically, a lot of people hire other people around them to be like, I'm doing this, and I'm just going to tell you the 3 little things you can do that I'm basically doing, but you're just going to help me. That's not collaboration. That's not co-creation. So you'll notice probably if you were to look at my life, 10 years ago and today,
Mhm.
every single project I'm working on, there's either someone I'm collaborating with on every aspect of it, or I'm just not moving alone. So even if I'm writing a book, I'm like, who's doing my forward, my afterward, who's all reading it to make sure that it actually resonates with my beliefs and with movement, that I'm being accountable to something larger than myself. Right. So to me, it's like letting go of the aloneness, dropping into community, but not the amorphous, like the
Of
people.
course, right.
Like, I'm like, I have a set number of people who I know I can call on and who I deeply feel politically aligned with, and we move together.
What
And we're
happens
not
when
having to
those
move
people are
against
no
someone
longer your
else.
people? Sorry. What happens when those
So
people are no longer your people?
a lot of different, yeah, a lot of different things. So it depends on the why. It depends on the why, right? I think if there's conflict, those people don't have to no longer be your people. If a conflict can be generative, they can still be your people. Sometimes it's just they change positions or change places relative to where you're sitting.
Right.
Um, I've had people that I have deeply disappointed. I've had people who have deeply disappointed me. And so it's a question of like, are we going to live long enough to recover from those disappointments? Is it
Mm.
of interest to us to find our way back together? And then I've become like a boundary queen. So My I've also been learning a
Do
lot
tell, because
about
bitches
like,
need to know. Me, I'm bitches.
I love it.
What's this
So
boundary business?
my friend Prentice Hemphill said this quote, which is, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and myself simultaneously.
Mm.
And I've been like saying that everywhere, because I'm like, there's a lot of people I care about, but they're not the people who can be in and of my daily life. They either are wanting to cause me harm, don't want to see me shine, don't understand what it is I'm trying to do, committed to misunderstanding me, or just, whatever reason we don't vibe, right? Which I think is also fine. And I feel like that took me a while to be like, oh, everyone in movement isn't going to just like love each other. Not at
When
all,
did you
right?
find that out? I'm still
It was
developing
about
that.
23.6. No, but I feel like it was just this moment of like, because probably you experience this too, is that a lot of us come into movement. It's like, this is a family. We are all like united in solidarity and we have each other's backs. And like, then something real happens and folks either scurry or show up. And you learn
Mm.
so much about what's possible in those moments. There's been times when I've done both. There's been times when I have dropped everything and showed up. There's been times when I was like, oh, I don't want to show up. And that shows me something about what this means to me. Now I try to put myself in places where I'm like, I want to show up. I'm doing exactly what I want to do. These are my
Right.
people, and they can be there for me. I'm a Virgo oldest child giver. Like, I'm just like, I will give, give, give. And it's taken
I
me a
wish I
long
would have
time to
known
get
you
to
was a
where I'm like,
Virgo.
that I'm a Virgo.
I wish I would have known because I was just telling my makeup artist, she's not mine, but I
I
call
love
her
that you
that
say that.
because it's
The makeup artist that made your face up.
yes,
Yeah.
it's just a lot of words. And so I told Natalia, I was like, I need people in my home that are Virgos. Because it just makes better sense. Like
Hi.
y'all are in, y'all are out. I mean, you come and maybe you didn't even mean to show up. You just it's a Virgo sighting, and so I appreciate those.
I appreciate, um, I understand that astrology is like, oh, everyone is all signs and, whatever it is. I'm like, it works for me. But I really appreciate the way that it's structured around like, oh, I want to help. Helping people makes me feel nourished. It makes me feel whole. It makes me feel connected. And then this past few years of my life have been like, what does it feel like to actually be met by people who
Mm,
care for me as much as I care for them? And how do I change to let the care in, even if it's like, that's not how I wanted the dishwasher loaded, but that is still, you loaded the dishwasher, which is amazing. That,
Right.
thank you, or whatever, it is like,
Right.
how do I soften my perfectionism, which is always going to be dissatisfied, into my relationality, which
That's
can,
so important.
so
Because we have expectations that we think that we're not putting on people. And I loved what you had said. You'd said, that unless there's only one time in our lives where we're not causing harm, and that's like the period of where we're a 1 month old baby. Because anything after that, you're pooping into diapers or missing the diaper entirely, shit is all up the back, right? And so, I think sometimes when we have these conversations,
mm,
a lot of us, myself included, don't know how to operate in nuance. We're so holistic and we talk about the duality and we
like
talk
how
about,
to,
harm and being harmed, and we cause harm and other people cause us harm. But how do you apologize when you've caused harm, knowing that other people have also harmed you? Like what is the method? What is the methodology? Whatever the fuck that word is, whatever is that word, right?
yeah.
How do you do that and still be true to yourself without being like, oh, they chumped me on that one?
I mean, Mia Mingus has done an incredible piece of writing on how to give a good apology. So I would recommend like Google that. It's like step by step. I will say in practice in my life, I I try to wait to give an apology till I really understand what I did. And that piece sometimes takes a while. So sometimes I'll say that I'm like, I don't fully understand yet what I did. Give me some time. Like give me a
Right.
little bit. I will get there. I just need a little bit of space to reflect, especially if it's called publicly or named publicly first before, I'm like, I'm private. I still think of myself as so private in so many ways. And so I have to like
Yeah, I was like, I
birth
don't know
out
nothing
that
about you.
word.
I'm like looking, I'm like, do she like focaccia bread? I don't know. Like, there's no photos. Like,
No, it's private, right? Um, but I say that because I'm like, I think a lot of people are like that. Like we actually need a little while to make sure if we did something, probably we didn't think that was going to be a harmful thing. That space between our intention and our impact, it can be miles, days, years long, So actually being able to be like, oh, here's what I did that was harmful. I understand that it was harmful and I can commit to not doing that thing again.
right,
And to me, I don't want an apology. And anyone who's been partnered with me knows this. I'm like, don't apologize if you're not actually going to change your behavior. I don't want
right.
apology. I definitely don't want that same apology more than once. I want
Mm,
apology that is tied to new behavior. And in myself, I want that too. That I'm like, if I say, I'm so sorry I did that, that it's also because I'm changing my awareness around how I'm doing things. And
right.
I really want to be learning in public. I want to be the kind of person who's capable of that.
Why do you want to be learning in public? I feel like a
Yeah.
lot of us struggle with it.
I think I think that if you're not in a public figure location, I don't think you necessarily have to. But I think if you let yourself or become or pursue any kind of public location, like I feel like I have surrendered to having a certain public location because when I started my career, I was like, I'm a facilitator and I'm a writer, I'm a nerd, and I'm behind the scenes,
Right,
helping the superstars, helping the movement stars, helping those people lift up. That's my work. And but in the process of my writing, I have also become a public figure in and of my own right. So if I'm going to hold that public position, I can't assume that I've got to hold it with perfection, that I'm going to always say and do and be all things to all people and perfect. That's definitely not going to happen. So a lot of times now I'm at the level where I'll do or say something and a lot of people will love it. And then some people will be like, that's some bullshit. And I'm
right,
like, okay, that's some bullshit. I have to not just tune that out or ignore it. I also have to not make that the center. I have to be
mm,
balanced inside of that. Like, it's not bullshit to me. So, how do I move? Did I
right,
harm someone? How do I apologize? And not just say I'm sorry, but actually learn whatever it is so that I don't keep causing the same kinds of harm to people.
right,
And, I also sit in that location. Like, if I'm not the one to lead on something or to say something, I really try to let that in too. And I really try to do a lot of reflection on like, who can do this? There's been books that I wanted to write and put out that I was like, oh, someone else is doing something similar. I'm going to hold back. Let me stay in my lane or let me pull back and create more room. sometimes that's the apology, right? Is like, oh,
Mm,
I don't need to take up the space there even. How can I support someone else's leadership? So for me, I think that's the piece. I think it just takes so much more time than like the pace of social media. So
okay.
when I'm supporting people as a facilitator, mediator, also I'll say, you might need to make a public statement right now. It's likely not going to be authentic yet. So
Mm,
let's keep doing the work to make sure you can authentically learn from whatever happened. And like, I love what you were saying about the relationship justice. It's like, I think of it as like there's a channel
right,
between any two people. And if that channel is not clear,
right,
right, and whatever you're saying through it is going to be dinged and donged by whatever's in that channel, you know? So I'm like, I've had people apologize to me, but I'm like, but you're a liar.
right.
Because that was the channel was, I was like, but there's 4 lies between what you're saying and what I'm hearing.
Right. And I think that that's what I meant is that a lot of times there's a missing link in transformative justice. There's a missing link. I think that it's great to go back to indigenous practices, but if that's the only indigenous practice that we are engaging in, right, then we're not relating relationally to any one of us like this. We're
Yeah.
just like, abolish prisons, abolish ICE. And
Right,
like, we're like,
right.
I'm not talking to this bitch ever again because you're like, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just trying to be like by myself. And I appreciate so much what you just said about sometimes being alone isn't the way to go. Being alone is good, but when you're working as an individual and as part of a community, you're going to need to collaborate with some community individuals. And I've
Yeah.
been criticized often. One of my business partners is like, you can't ever do anything by yourself. And I'm like, it's not that I can't do anything by myself. It's just, it's so much better
Yeah.
when it's bounced off the room of the echo chamber we want to keep the things safe in.
Right.
Right. It's not just me saying, my shit sounds good. Time
That's
to
right.
publish it.
That's right. And I think there's something, I think this is always a line to walk as a writer that, you know, it's like there's 2 things that are true. One is as a writer, I have to be true to my own voice. So I have to write stuff that I'm like, I fully 100% like trust this thing I said or this thing I wrote. Like this is the truth as I know it, right? And then
Right.
there's the other part, which is I am in community at all times, even if it's just in community with the trees or in community with that chicken that gave me an egg or whatever. But I'm always in community. I'm always in right. I have to be in relationship to survive. I have been saying this a lot lately that we're one of the only species. We are born into someone else's hands, still connected to someone else's body. Like the structure of our species is connection. That's what we are meant to be. So capitalism is that lie that's like, no, you can survive somehow on your own. And then people end up on their own, like maybe very productive and efficient, but so lonely. And I find
Mm,
people are getting so lonely, even sometimes when they're surrounded by people or they're on social media all the time, but that deep soul part is not getting any kind of nourishment. It's not getting touched. It doesn't get apologized to. It doesn't get seen for when it does feel hurt. So I keep thinking about that part of like, how do you actually get the relationships that are real that you really want? And
right.
I'm doing all the time with people. I'm like, oh, I have to be more honest about what I actually want, which includes alone time, but not an alone life, you know?
I really needed this energy today. Thank you. I needed the alone time, but not an alone life. Thank you so much for that. That was really, oh, my heart feels a little warm. Like I had some like tiger balm tea. So thank you. Yes.
Hey, Tiger.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. It's amazing. You just
Thank
changed my life.
you.
Go
Thank you.
Google.
You got to get some. Um, a good colleague of mine, Grace Solaris, makes it, and it's so delightful. It kind of reminds me of the Bengal spice,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
tea or whatever, right? Like, you know. So,
Okay, good.
anywho, so I have like 2 more questions to ask you because I know that it's a packed day for both me and you.
Yeah.
And so, I'm actually going to deviate from the list of questions that my team spent all month preparing because it's a I love y'all so much. Yo, shout out. I have between the White Labor Collective and also the Done for Didi group, I have 34 volunteers. Some of them are paid because Black, right?
Oh,
But I have 34 volunteers, and I'm like, I don't deserve this. And you had said something in one of your speeches I was listening to, and I was getting my face beat. And it was like, a lot of times we don't give ourselves rest because we're like, we're not done working enough for it yet. And, like we need to shift away from that thinking. So I wanted to ask you, um, as someone who has facilitated a lot of social justice movement work, right? And I know I'm also surmising that that means that you have tried to help nonprofits move from a model of nonprofiteering, right? What does it look like to have emergent strategy used in nonprofit setting and actually be combined with the revolution will not be funded? And I don't know if anyone's ever asked you that question, but I think that those are two very important texts that, like you had said, although I've never read either book, the concepts are there for me. I
yeah.
know them. I walk into rooms with them and I'm like, we cannot operate this way. You can operate this way, but my integrity is not going to be intact if I continue to work for this company while it operates this way. And so for the many of us who are still fortunate enough to have jobs, but yet we work in the nonprofit sector, but then we also come home and we put on our organizer hat, how is there a way to affect change? Can we do Audrey's work? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I feel very defeatist a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say some things I know on this. They're not definitive. It's like, I think that's what the nonprofit sphere actually needs to prove right now is I think philanthropy and nonprofits, like this is the test, is in a moment like this with all the changes afoot, can nonprofits and philanthropy actually pivot and release control and increase abundance enough to meet this moment? And I think the moment it's like we're watching right now who can make those adaptations and who's not going to be able to. And there's a piece in The Revolution Will Not Be Funded that is by Paulo Rojas, I believe. And it's like, are the cops in our heads or in our hearts? And it talks about the way that movements arise and go in and out in Latin America. And that piece stood out to me when I was writing Emergent Strategy and thinking about how do we create spaces where we're not so tied to building these individual organizations that are competing with each other for a limited amount of funds, but instead movements where we can flow the resources as they need to those groups who are funding the work. Right now, Black Visions Collective in Minneapolis went from being this tiny organization to suddenly multi-million-dollar funded organization.
Right.
Now they have to figure out, how do we adapt to this abundance while staying on our mission, staying on path about defunding the police and about uplifting Black liberation?
Right.
That's an interesting adaptation that I feel like we see so many groups now having to be like, how do we scale up to the level of change that's needed in this moment while maintaining the kind of deep relationships that it's going to take to hold each other accountable to an actual revolutionary vision rather than the reform work that happens on the way. And
Right.
I stay very curious about how people are applying emergent strategy. I think I'm a student of emergent strategy. Like, even though I'm like, I wrote this book, I wrote it from a student position. But I'm like, I'm still trying to understand what it looks like to bring transformative justice to life. I'm still trying to understand what it looks like to be adaptive with intention rather than reactivity.
Right.
This
Okay.
administration is a highly reactive one, and a lot of nonprofits have been reacting, trying to be like, oh, now we're doing this, now we're doing that. It's like, are you in touch with your
There's
purpose?
no package coming for the states. And I'm like, there was never a package. I could have told you
That's not
that.
how it
And
works.
I have a GED. I could have told you that there was no package coming from the state. So how do we operate with that information and still walk in the integrity of what our mission is?
And I think
Don't
one
get
of
me
the things
started.
I think that helps is I really look at organizations that have some component that is grassroots funded. So some aspect where the community is supporting it. I think if you are doing work that is relevant to your community, you will never go hungry. If you are not, you will always be striving and struggling to make your point that you need to exist. And you may have to sunset. I think a lot of organizations may sunset in these times, not necessarily because they weren't useful, but because as the conditions change, they're not able to adapt to stay useful
Right.
in new conditions, where it's like, it doesn't matter if you're a funder darling. It matters if you're a community darling. It matters if you're super relevant and making material shift.
Woo.
So Yeah,
I'm
I think it's really
tired.
interesting. And, you know, philanthropy, I know amazing people in the philanthropy world who are like thinking about this stuff and trying to
Right.
figure out, can we be of use? And that's the question. I'm like, everyone needs to ask. I just have to laugh. I have a turtle behind me,
What's the
and
turtle's name?
Nalito, and the turtle is
Nalito.
quiet 22 hours of the day. But whenever I'm doing a live event, the turtle's like, I need to dig in my house now. It's like, anyway, it might be loud.
It's fine. I really appreciate the framing of that question because I just think of, I've been working on a nonprofit article for the past year and a half now because I chose to do it alone. I chose not to reach out to anyone. I want to hear my own voice in the echo chamber. But I've been reaching out to people Black femmes and non-men who work in the nonprofit field. I've seen stories like Erin Lang's. I've seen stories like what happened at a FAMU. And I just really want to amplify nonprofits, and I hate that I work for one because I believe their mission is good and I worry about the steps we're taking to get to good. Are they in
Yeah,
alignment with the
things
community?
like, I think one thing that I often will remind myself is I'm like, at least people in nonprofits are trying. And if we can make good on that effort, like, oh, there's an intention here
Right,
to not be stuck in that capitalist cycle of constantly benefiting off of other people's suffering. That was an intention. That was in the
right.
seeds, right? But I think, you know, right now I'm really interested in collective models. I'm interested in hybrid models. I'm like, if you can't adapt to the changing conditions on the ground, you know, you're not going to be of use. And this is a moment where everyone needs to play their position.
Thank you for saying hybrid models. We are turning Done for Didi into a hybrid model because you know me, I'm all
Yay.
about my middle name should be about my paper, cut the check, Delgado, right? And so
Yeah.
because it's just people are always going to try to keep me out of spaces. And a lot of the spaces I get into, I'm embarrassed half the time that I go into the spaces because people are like, no, we wanted you here for street credibility and presence. But as
Oh,
soon as you
yeah.
start talking, we need to keep you under a 5-minute minimum while we have the real PhDs here who happen to
Yeah.
be Black. And I'm like, wow, y'all just want to embarrass me every time. Okay, Harvard. So, anyways, whatever. Basically, what I'm doing is what you exactly you said. I want to turn my business model of speaking engagements and this, that, and the third into a larger platform. And so I've been working with some amazing people. Shout out to Monique Melton, who was like, you need to charge more. And I was like, I already charged $90 for the class. And she's like, no, what's wrong with you? Engage in capitalism for a little bit.
Or it's
you know?
also like, you know, what's interesting is I think of it as a gift economy. Like I think in terms of a gift economy, and I think
Mm,
in terms of cooperative models, and I think in terms of how do you receive what is of value. So a lot of times I'll make an offer, like when I'm serving a lot of the Black organizations I work for, I'm like, you pay me whatever feels right to you. Like I'm not going to give you like a rate. And there's also groups that I go to, and I'm like, it is of service to my heart and my life to get to do anything with you. You don't have to pay me anything at all. And I think it's important to keep the full range, right? Like I always want to have some people who I'm like, I would just do anything to show up and get to be around y'all, you know,
right,
like with the whole, you know, when I've gotten to work for like BYP 100 and Movement for
right,
Black Lives Matter groups, I'm like, I can't believe I get to be supporting what y'all are doing. You're making history and it's so relevant. And there's no question in my mind that anytime I give to you, the universe is going to make sure I'm good because I supported it. And then there's other stuff that I'm like, I don't see that clear. You know, it doesn't feel like that. Here's the charge, right?
right,
Or
right.
to universities and institutions that I'm like, you don't even want to change. Like you want to use me to make you look good, but you don't really want to change. So I'm going to have to come in and try to be a fire breathing dragon and try to change the conditions and try to light up as many minds as I can. And you're going to pay
Right.
me a lot to do that. So I feel like having that full spectrum is what makes it work for me, you know? And there's some
Thank
folks
you
where I'm
for
like,
coming on this
that's
show
not
for
a real
free.
thing, I'm not going to do it, you know? Yeah, I was really excited to support this effort and what you're doing. And, um, you know, I'm just like, I'm much more inclined to go into spaces where I'm like, okay, a Black femme is holding this space and I'm interested in what kind of conversations we can have. And especially where it's like, it's outside of the ivory tower, it's outside of
Right,
the spaces that, you know, get a lot of attention as being like, this is a valid space for these conversations. You know, I
right.
like
Thank you
the
for
fact that
saying that.
we're having this conversation. We are making each other's ideas valid by having the conversation.
Something you said, this is my second to last question. Something you said always
You
sits with
said
me.
that 4 questions ago.
Something you say always sits with me.
Yeah.
I don't trust nobody. I think that that's a t-shirt that I have. I think it might be a tattoo I'm about to get. But you have said something. You said, how do we know that people are trustworthy? People become trustworthy when we trust them. And so I would love to one day hear from you, a writing from you, just on trust and how to build it, what happens when it's broken. If you have that and you wrote it in your book, I apologize. So
I was like, even if I write it, you're not gonna read it, Dee Dee. I just
read it because it would just be an excerpt. I could do
okay.
excerpts.
So there's a section on it in Emergent Strategy under interdependence.
Okay,
And
okay.
then I have a forthcoming book called Holding Change that is about the way of facilitation and mediation in emergent strategy. And there's a section there on what are ways that you build trust in a group, in a room between people? Like how do you actually create conditions where trust can seed? So I've done some writing about it. I think about it all the time.
We've got 4 minutes left. I wanted to ask you the last question I ask every single one of my guests. And
Okay.
it's a two-prong question because I'm a two-prong complicated bitch. I just want to know literally what is in, like, did we cover the bases? I feel like you answered a question I had, but I was like, we ain't got time for it. You was like, I'm working on this project. Ah.
Right.
Um, is there a question or a topic that we didn't touch that you were like really shocked about? You don't have to go into the topic. I just want to hear it for my own retribution. And then who would you like to see on the show?
Oh, beautiful. Okay. The first part, there's nothing, no, I feel very satisfied by the conversation that we
Thank
had.
you.
Yeah, I feel very satisfied by it. Someone who I'd love to see come on the show is a comrade of mine named PG Watkins, who
Okay.
is a Detroit based organizer and has been leading up the effort for the 313 Liberation Zone,
Okay.
which again, is like Black direct action, like Black uprising work in Detroit. And they are brilliant. And I think everyone should be interviewing them and talking to them and like uplifting them and
I
hiring
will
them.
reach
So,
out to them.
yay.
Thank you so much for your time today. I'm glad that we got the smush because it's everything that I needed to get me through the rest of my week. So I appreciate you. You are loved by so many. I hold space for you in my heart. And I'm glad that this is, even it's virtual, this is my first time meeting you. And I celebrate who you are, not because of your work, but just because you're being and existing at the same space as me. So thank you.
My tail is wagging. I'm receiving all the blessings.
I haven't moved since you centered me. I won't do it.
Right. Well, and you can call on that anytime, like literally, because I'm always like, oh, meditation, I don't have 20 minutes to do it. But I'm like, I
Mhm.
always have 5 seconds to be like, am I even sitting?
Right. Okay.
Can I breathe into my butt? Yes.
Adrienne, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. This has been another full and wholesome content, which we never do of the full set. So thank you so much. I
Thank
hope
you
that you
so
have an amazing afternoon and that you take care of yourself as best as you can today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Thank you for opening this space and making it what you need it to be. It's really brave. It's really beautiful to see what you're creating here.
Thank
Bless you.
you. Peace, y'all.